Hi, investors. Today we're going to talk about why the NOI for a property always beats the 1% rule or the price per unit rule. So we're going to look at two different properties which sold for very different price per units and rent ratios, but they sold for almost identical cap rates and why that is. So property A that we're going to look at was a nice 8-unit property that all the units were pretty similar, 2-bedroom, 1-bath. And the rents, of course, were all a little bit varied. But if you take the total rent divided by the amount of units, this is the average rent. And then you apply the 1% rule, which is this average rent divided by that price on a per unit basis. You get 0.93%, so almost the 1% rule. So this might be a pretty good buy, right? But let's go over and look at property B. So with property B, we've got almost the identical setup here with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. And you have a rents, again, that are varied, with the average rent actually being a little bit higher than property A. But because the price that it sold for was a good bit higher, that rent ratio of the average rent divided by that sale price per unit is about 0.8, which is actually lower than property A, which almost reached the 1% rule. So you might say that property A was the better buy, right? But let's go back and look at property A and the income for that property. So we're going to look at the top line income, the gross income, and then apply all your typical expenses to the property. So you've got the vacancy, which is going to be the same on both properties, just so we can compare apples to apples, the same management fee, then the property-specific taxes, insurance, maintenance, and utilities for the property. So if you go down and look at the net operating income and apply a cap rate, just as a reminder, the cap rate is the net operating income divided by the sale price of the property, gets you to a 6.7% cap rate and almost a 1% income to debt service coverage ratio. So the debt we're assuming is a 75% LTV, 25 years at 7% interest rate, and that income basically almost covers the debt service. So go back to property B, and let's look at the income for that property. We did the same thing here, the gross income with the same 5% with the expenses applied to the property. But here, the tenants pay for all the utilities on the property, which results in a greater NOI relative to what the unit sold for. So if you apply the NOI divided by the purchase price, pretty much identical cap rate and identical debt coverage ratio here as well. So which property is the better deal? Well, if you look at these two, it really comes down to the reason that net operating income is the better metric than a price per unit or the 1% ratio rule is because the net operating income takes into account the expenses for the property. So big, if any of these expenses are higher or lower on one property versus the other, then that's going to, of course, result in a higher or lower income at the end of the day. So investors are buying the income and, of course, the future value of the property. So if you look at the income, this is the equalizer, but then you also have to take into account what other expenses you may have. So with property A, you have maybe a little bit of an older building and the expenses for the utilities are a much higher amount. Whereas over on property B, the tenants are paying for all the utilities because the utilities were separately metered.